And now what I know you came for, Cecilia.
Right. Je vais parler français, mais
I'll speak in French.
Dear Paul Rich, Professor Paul Rich, who is really the mastermind of this conference, as well as Professor Guillermo de los Reyes and Dan Gutierrez, who did so much to prepare this conference. And, sorry, bon, maintenant je passe en français. Ils ont déjà été remerciés plusieurs fois, mais je peux...
They were thanked already, but our Grand Master, Georges Sérignac, who inaugurated this conference, and our Très Sage and Perfect Grand Venerable Philippe Guilguilmy, and the Chamber administration, Pierre Mollier as well, and the team of the Freemasonry Museum, Thierry Cousin in particular. I can't name them all, but many of them helped out this morning, Pascal Prévost as well. I won't name everyone, and I apologize. And I apologize, and I'm really sorry that Margaret Jacobs couldn't be with us today, but you'll all be able to read her text that will be published. It's already on ipsonet.org. So today, I'm going to speak about the culture of the Enlightenment. It will be a sort of introduction to this conference. Many of you are going to then discuss this topic. As you know, Freemasonry appears in the wake of the Enlightenment in a religious and political context that was more favorable than the previous century in 1717 or 1721. And my friends Andrew Prescott and Susan Thomas are going to tell you more about it this afternoon in the Grusier Temple. So a more favorable context after the replacement of the monarchy of divine right by the parliamentary monarchy, and after the partial emancipation of religious dissidents. The Enlightenment emerged in the Netherlands, in England, and in Scotland before they arrived in France and several other European countries. They were more or less radical or moderate, to recall historians' terminology. Affiliated lodges to the first Grand Lodge that we call the Grand Lodge of the Moderns, but only since the year 1751, because before it was just named the Grand Lodge. And these lodges had a minimal ritual practice. It was more the recital of catechisms, for each passage from one degree to another. And these simple rituals were using builder's tools, symbolically, such as the compass, the square, the plumb line. And as it was an oral culture, rituals weren't written but learned by heart. We had to wait, quite paradoxically, for the exposures, the divulgations of secrets from 1730, for rituals to be more defined, set, and shared more easily, in France more particularly. And for this reason, if we want to have an idea of the ritual practices of lodges, we must rely on the speeches made at the time, as well on the rituals. So welcoming speeches, for instance, given when apprentices were received, venerable, worshipful masters, grand masters, when the first stone of public buildings were laid. And these speeches were a way of perceiving the main principles that was defining the Freemasonry in the 18th century. In France, the Blue Lodges were practicing similar rites than the modern lodge. And the side degrees were almost inexistent in England at the time. In France, there were numerous, there was a multitude of them, and they were quite random and disorganized. So it would be very difficult to find a formalized ritual, specific ritual in these side degrees. But what we can confirm is that, in a very official way, the first grand chapter of French Rite was constituted on the 2nd of February, 1784. It was the first jurisdiction of side degrees in France. This assumes that French Rite chapters did exist before this date, and the Lodge of Friendship, to which belonged Rite de Montalot, practiced quite probably the French Rite side degrees, and it's quite likely that this French Rite practice in side degrees appeared at the same time as the Grand Orient de France from 1773, and Pierre, Mollier and Colette Léger, more particularly, are going to tell you more about it tomorrow at the BNF. In today's world, it seems more relevant to study the values rather than the date of rituals, and in this regard, the philosophy of the Enlightenment had a direct inspiration on the French Rite. This is what we want to explain today. I will do it in 3 chapters. First, the philosophical culture of the Enlightenment. Today and yesterday, the rejection of the dogmas, from the rejection of dogmas to a critical mind. The Enlightenment are progressively replacing to the concept of a natural law, that is to say a divine law, a godly law, the one of natural rights. In the previous century, mankind had no freedom of choice of action since there were the toy of divine will. Spinoza, John Locke, and English, Scottish, German philosophers, French philosophers disrupted this prejudice by encouraging men to use their understanding, to prefer reason to blind belief, and to use their critical mind. And in the academic, scientific, philosophical, political realms, writers are freeing themselves from censorship, are daring to do so. Kant, as the philosopher Barthes, or even Weishaupt at the head of Illuminatis, encourage mankind, so men in general, in reaching maturity by freeing themselves from all supervision, guardianship. Jean Mondeau today is with us. He's a professor from Bordeaux, Montaigne, and he will tell you more about this in detail. Carl Friedrich Barth, a doctor in theology, professor in philosophy in Germany, initiated in London by the Grand Lodge of England around circa 1777, attacked by Baril, gives us in 1787 a definition, very clear definition of the Enlightenment in his essay called What Does Enlightenment Mean? It's a hymn to freedom. And I quote, the freedom of thinking and judging is the only true source of all type of human enlightenment. And without them, we cannot shape our minds. The Enlightenment are at the origin of every human happiness. True happiness is not possible without the Enlightenment. And the more a man's enlightenment increases, the more his capacity to become happy is growing. Kant gives us a final injunction, sapere aude, dare to know, and he encourages men to grow by using reason and thinking by themselves. The Enlightenment is a way for man to live, to come out of a minority that is attributable to him. The minority is the incapacity to use one's understanding without another person's supervision. Sapere aude. Have the courage to use your own understanding. This is the Enlightenment motto. And let's look at what Weishaupt has to say, the head of the Illuminatis. Why would it be impossible for humankind to reach the highest level of perfection, the capacity to control themselves? Why should they always be driven when they know how to control, how to drive themselves? Is it impossible for the humankind, or to its greatest, its majority, to become major one day? Men are encouraged to reason, and many authors of Masonic speeches in English are going to use the metaphor of geometry so that they guide Masons towards the virtues. they should adopt. We are close to this geometrical mind inaugurated by Pascal and specified by Voltaire. The usage today, I think, ones that we call a geometrical mind, what is a methodical mind. Once we establish that humankind can evolve, can be perfectible through education and the use of reason, of course, we should all look for happiness on mind. Men have the right, the duty to work in joy. Sociability and friendliness are at the heart of the Enlightenment as well as Freemasonry. So how does the French Rite, how is it part of this trend of minds? When Rocher de Montalot in the Chamber of Degrees are putting order in the degrees of the French Rite, it's because they wanted to simplify and clarify what they thought was a very rich rite. And it was not just an accumulation of details or symbols, but it was about it being a transparent message. The rite must be structured in an educational way. That's why the French Rite only has 7 degrees, 3 plus 4, completed by a 5th order, and it corresponds to the initial 81 degrees. In the initiation ceremony, the French Rite favors the symbolic of the different ages of life. Each man, each woman is encouraged to grow, to reach, thanks to work, the age of reason, to become major. The same way as Kant and the Illuminatis encourage men to come out of their minority. Brothers and sisters are encouraged to exert their critical mind, a personal work without supervision, sponsorship, in one word, to emancipate. Each and every one of them must stand up to speak up. However, men can't live alone. They're a social animal, as the philosophers of the Enlightenment proved it. That's why they must educate each other, be in touch with one another. And the art of conversation, which at the time of the Enlightenment meant an exchange between individuals, was represented by sociability and friendliness, and it's very much promoted within Freemasonry. Within the French Rite, collective work goes alongside the individual journey. So from the religious culture of the Enlightenment to secularism, that's the second chapter. After having persecuted for centuries in England and up to the Glorious Revolution in France, after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, John Locke's tolerant arguments were finally winning, and the climate was in favor of the constitution of lodges. You will hear about the Scottish influence in this area this afternoon. John Locke was Scottish. Let's not forget it. So beacons of religious tolerance appeared, such as these lodges, almost immediately provoked the rejection of the Pope and the infamous Bull of 1738. And this is what explains why reason and religion are considered as compatible in England and antinomic in the Roman world, to the point that Voltaire, initiated by the famous Lodge of the Nine Sisters, wanted to crush the infamous. Margaret Jacobs showed the interferences between John Toland, Robert Collins, Rousseau Domesday, the pantheists, freethinkers, and the first lodges in the Netherlands and in England. In his Pantheisticon, John Toland is praising Socratic society made of pantheists who are sharing meals in a friendly way, making religion a joyous and not a sad occasion like Catholics or Calvinists. You will notice, as Toland said, that their religion is simple, clear, easy, pure, free. It's not pretentious, made up, difficult, incomprehensible, dependent. his minds are not frivolous, and they're not subjected to impious superstitions, cruelties, and childish gains. That was written in 1720. An anonymous treaty in 1743 defines the philosopher as any thinker coming away from God to find an interest in society. Bernard Picard, who's the author of the first iconographic representation of Masonry, in his magnum opus called Ceremonies and Religious Customs of All Populations Around the World. The first volumes are published in 1736, between 1723 and 1736. Picard is putting on an equal footing every Western and Eastern religions, which is quite a feat at the time, and it's granting a significant importance to Freemasonry. In the same way, Anderson, between 1723 and 1738, is asking Freemasons to believe in this religion that will bring them all together instead of opposing them. They must have a choice, provided they're not atheists. It's, of course, a significant restriction, but it must be put back into its context. Religious dogmas, theological, rigid precepts are rejected in favor of a more horizontal religion, flexible religion. Men have every freedom to believe. Thomas Paine, Bonneville's friend, and the author of an essay on Freemasonry, who was probably not a member of any lodge. His mind was probably a bit too free for that. And he recommends to his Freemasons, his friends, to turn towards the religion of the Druids rather than revealed religions that are trapping them into a dogma. But he does write this essay on Freemasonry. He's giving them tips. At the time he was living in England, which was quite a thing there, English Freemasonry at the end of the 18th century. Religion's tolerance will only thrive when the philosophical doubt is allowed, relying on reason. The French Rite relies on this foundation of tolerance since Rottier de Montalot. And in 1877, Frederick Desmond succeeded in majorly changing in the Article 1 of the Constitution of the Grand Orient de France. So he replaced the obligation to believe in God and the immortality of the soul by the freedom of conscience. And later on, this was what became absolute freedom of conscience. And the great architect of the universe didn't disappear from the constitutions, but the phrase was more or less put aside in the French Rite in the 20th century. Indeed, this notion was later assimilated to a transcendental principle, even the acknowledgement of a single, unique God in the tradition of monotheist religions. When Anglo-Saxon Freemasonry still imposes a belief in God and so allegiance to a dogma, the Freemasonry that's called liberal, in reference to the fundamental freedom of men, claims that that we need the absolute freedom of conscience. Today, in the French Rite, the Grand Master Philippe Guglielmi promotes a new appellation, a new name, very clear one, the one of an adogmatic Freemasonry. Every lodge, every chapter of the French Rite are claiming, when they inaugurate their works, their allegiance to the Republican principles of freedom, equality and fraternity. A modern translation of the religious tolerance of the Enlightenment. Third chapter, from the political culture of the Enlightenment to the emancipations and to the Republic. In England, both the rejection of the absolute monarchy and Catholicism in the wake of the Glorious Revolution of 1788, these rejections allowed the birth of the Enlightenment and of Freemasonry in a peaceful religious and political context. The American Revolution will find an inspiration in these principles, and a century later will reject George III nepotism. The number of lodges doubled during the revolutionary years in the Americas. the contrary to what happened a bit later during the French Revolution. It would be wrong to say that Freemasonry was always an adept of emancipation speeches. And we know today that some Freemasons were sometimes partisans of slavery and sometimes abolitionists. And this is what they are actually talking about in the temple next door with Eric Saunier. When in England, the main abolitionists were mostly evangelists and Methodists. The figure of Victor Schellcher, a Freemason, both in favor of the Republic in 1848 and the abolition of slavery, his figure dominates the debate in France. The British and American Enlightenment are not much marked by republicanism, contrary to the French Enlightenment. However, the Scott Ramsay, we owe it to him this beautiful phrase: the whole world is a big republic, each nation is a family, and each individual a child. Ramsay was at the time the speaker at the Grand Lodge, the former Grand Orient de France, and he made this famous speech in 1737 and 1736. The Illuminatis, who were radical, and that's what concerned the Freemasons, starting with George Washington, they erected cosmopolitanism as a Masonic virtue, so that Freemasonry could develop itself. We needed a minimal dose of democracy. We know that this period of repression, of tyranny, and in a context of where freedoms were deprived, and we know that Freemasons were amongst the first victims. We don't have enough hindsight to know about the situation in Russia and Ukraine. Masonic obediences were not protected from diplomatic divisions that were separating people. Let's have a look, however, on the theme, the topic that is bringing us together today, the French Rite as bearer of the culture of the Enlightenment. The Grand Chapitre Général encouraged the development of the French Rite in the world, and new grand chapters to thrive and to become independent whilst keeping their bonds of fraternity amongst each other. On the 25th of April 2011 was adopted in Lisbon a Charter of Fundamental Principles for the French Rite that was signed by 17 Grand Chapters Grand Chapitres Généraux in France and abroad. Today, there are 30 GCGs of French Rite in the whole world. This charter claims the liberal principles and adogmatic principles of Freemasonry, that is to know absolute freedom of conscience for all Freemasons of the French Rite. And the Ramsay meetings allow the grand chapters of the French Rite to sign this charter and to meet up regularly. To conclude, I hope you're still awake. The culture of the Enlightenment. The culture of the Enlightenment is at the heart of our democracies, of Freemasonry in general, and more particularly of the French Rite. However, it would be reckless, even irresponsible, to pretend that it's not a victim, that it hasn't been victim of attacks. The culture of the Enlightenment, a culture of religious tolerance, that we call in France secularism, has been threatened several times during the last decades. Nationalist, aggressive trends tried to attack this universalism of the Enlightenment. Some rely on the weaknesses of the Enlightenment, weaknesses that usually attributable to the historical context, such as the rejection of atheists, the exclusion of women, of the ones who were born in slavery, or even discrimination for ethnic reasons, were fully rejected what had been acquired during the Enlightenment. We should not stop using our critical mind. And this culture of the Enlightenment are about tolerance, universalism, about the emancipation of men and women and people. And the French Rite does relate to this culture that has allowed him to be shaped. Thank you.
Really enjoyed that. Now that is a lady who always has opinions, and strong ones. I might mention to you that in America we have a number of women's orders: the Eastern Star, the White Shrine, which has nothing to do with being white and nothing to do with the Shriners with fezzes, and the Order of the Amaranth. And of course, they have definite opinions. You should know that the Eastern Star hold to the view that they were established by the royal families of Scandinavia. If you believe that, I would like to sell you shares in the Eiffel Tower. I believe most Eastern Stars have now abandoned this story, but some still believe that they have a separate royal order that started in Scandinavia. I don't want to start an argument. At any rate, today we have Art and Joe, who are giving very, very interesting papers later today. But I felt that, I said, if we're having Christina, we have to have somebody comment on it. Because whenever she speaks, people want to comment. I'm going to say that we will break at 11:10, not 11:20. And I am praying that the caterer will be out there if you are hungry or need water or soda or something, I hope. And then we have 3 rooms functioning today because of the abundance of papers. So there are 2 other rooms. So we will break at 11:10 after some dialogue and go or stay as you wish, remembering there are 3 rooms and there will be refreshment all day. And then there's a grand reception tonight. And tomorrow we are guests of the Bibliothèque Nationale, who are always very kind. And we will have another rather nice reception tomorrow at the Biblio. Now I'm going to turn. They have mics. They can use the lectern, or they can use the mics. And over here, Mr. Wu has the mic. And if you have something that is biting you, just wave frantically, and he will bring the mic to you. All right, gentlemen. What did you think?
I thought that it was an outstanding talk, and I really thank you for that. A couple things came to mind. Rick Berman, in his book On the Birth of Modern Freemasonry, mentions that he believes that the original Grand Lodge kind of co-opted, maybe hijacked the ceremonies or the trappings of operative masonry to create the modern fraternity, and to promote some proto-Enlightenment ideas. This makes sense to me, and I've wondered, this being the case, why do you believe that they continue to promote the idea or introduce the idea that no women could be Masons if they were introducing ideals of the Enlightenment, and also in Article 1 of the Constitutions on God and religion, when they say that Masons should be of the religion in which all men agree to be good men and true, why they exclude people who were, at the time were anything other than Christian.
Okay, you want me to answer?
Yes, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this question, really. Well, you know, I think that women were excluded from the public sphere in the 18th century in England, anyway. So Anderson was just towing the line. But it's true that in France, there were lodges of adoption where women were accepted as sisters. And it was always sort of a mixed order with brethren and sisters together in the same lodges. But you're right. I mean, I don't want to be chauvinistic now and say that France was more on the side of the Enlightenment, but they did accept women as sisters, which was never the case in Britain at the time, right? And as far as God and religion is concerned, well, I think that Britain was lucky not to have the Catholic religion, right? They got rid of it at the Glorious Revolution. So the Church of England was really much more tolerant. And now this is the paradox, because in France we know that it is the church, the established church, but nevertheless it was much more tolerant than the Catholic Church, which was never established. This is the paradox. So I think that indeed this is why in France, well, in France, of course, the French Masons were absolutely traumatized by the ban put by the Pope. Excusez-moi, j'ai répondu en anglais.
I'm sorry, I answered in English because the question was in English, but I'd like to thank the interpreters because I imagine that they translated the question.
At this point also, what do you have an idea what the opinions of Dr. Desaguliers would have been in regard to women in Freemasonry? Do you believe that he was also just towing the party line, or being somewhat more enlightened himself, do you think he would have preferred something else?
I'm not sure. I cannot answer for him, but, but you know, I think he couldn't care less, I'm afraid, at the time, because nobody cared at the time, you know, for the presence of women in Freemasonry in early Britain. You have to admit that.
Well, thank you again, Cécile, for that wonderful paper. It actually, I appreciated where you brought in Dr. Carl Friedrich Barth and also Adam Weishaupt. They both kind of pair my first book on the Illuminati. And, a lot of what they were trying to do was establish a religion of man, more like deism and these sorts of things. And it kind of touches on John Toland and these sorts of fellows. Do you think that the difference between like the English Freemasonry versus the French Freemasonry, that it's kind of like the foundation may be laid in England, but then it might be, it changes in circumstances once it comes over to France sometime after the 1740s when we have a French Grand Master and no longer an English one? Do you think that it maybe like it starts in one place and then it moves to another? And do you also see parallels as far as like kind of like a Republican religion also in the early American Republic?
Yes, thank you. Well, I think indeed Freemasonry is closely linked to the context, right? But probably there were few differences between French and English Freemasonry, let's say in the first half of the 18th century. Of course, the French Revolution brought a different light, and with the presence of the Illuminati, and then so that really changed, of course. And sorry, the other question you asked is
the parallels with religion in France, Republican religion
yes,
in America.
yes, and America. Well, I think indeed Freemasonry really was very strong in America, and you know all your founding fathers are Freemasons, right? Washington, Paul Revere, and so yes, they had all read, of course, John Locke, who was not a Freemason, but they were influenced by the Enlightenment. And George Washington himself was a friend of Lafayette, as we all know. But of course, George Washington was a bit reluctant towards the Illuminati because he thought that they were a bit too revolutionary. Right.
Just to follow on that, you mentioned Thomas Paine. Well, when he, as you know, he was imprisoned in the French Revolution and barely escaped being executed himself. When he came back to America, he was friends with a gentleman by the name of Elihu Palmer, who they say was like the head of the Colombian Illuminati, but really what they were doing was more of like a Republican religion here in America. And interestingly enough, they were inspired by France. Do you see a lot of like transmission that way, like during the Revolution?
I mean, what you're telling me is very interesting regarding the, the friendship of Thomas Paine. Well, I know Thomas Paine, for instance, was a close friend of Nicolas de Bonneville. And Nicolas de Bonneville had written this essay entitled Les Jésuites pourchassés et de la franc-maçonnerie et leurs poignards brisés par les francs-maçons. Right, because he was really afraid of this influence of the Jesuits, and so indeed, I think there was a close relationship, yes, with the Illuminati, and but interestingly enough, Thomas Paine never really quotes them, but he quotes Bonneville all the time, yes.
And interesting, too, his close associate, Palmer, was also a Freemason as well. And so he seems to be surrounded by Masons and yet never joins.
Well, you know, I had this debate with Charles Porcé, and he kept telling me, you're wrong, he was a Freemason. You know how he would put it. And I said, all right, but let's find some evidence. And we never found any evidence. But I've always wished Charles Porcé was right. Because it's true, it would have been nice. But nobody has been able to prove it.
I have a question for all three of you. I'm going to put them on the spot. And they're all officers. Takes an hour to list their titles. Would you favor, Art, admitting women to all the degrees of the Scottish Rite?
I'm of the opinion that Freemasonry is like a tennis club, that there are men's tennis clubs, women's tennis clubs, and mixed clubs. Everybody plays tennis, but they might not play with each other, and as long as they all get along, I'm fine with that.
Joe?
I don't really personally have an opinion as far as, does it matter? I don't think so. If men and women want to be in lodge together, great. If they don't, that's fine as well with me. So I'm more of a laissez-faire type approach. So to whatever the lodge decides. So if the lodge likes men only, fine. If it wants women only, also fine. And if it wants mixed, also fine.
Cecilia, would you favor the Scottish Rite admitting women, or would you be afraid that it would affect the women's Scottish Rite?
Oh, that's a very tricky question, especially in front of specialists of the French Rite, you see. So I hope, but there is no French Rite in America, so we're not taking any risk by saying that, yes, it would be great if they accepted women, if they accepted sisters, indeed. And, you know, I just wanted to say that in Belgium, because here we have representatives of Belgium, there has been an evolution recently because the Grand Orient of Belgium was male only, and recently, well, they have adopted, in a way, your idea, because they have male lodges, female lodges, and mixed lodges, right? But, I mean, they will explain better themselves later. Yes, they are talking tomorrow, so they will discuss this.
Well, we can't let you off the griddle. Would you be willing to advocate admitting women to all the degrees in your rite? Give them life.
That's a good question.
C'est déjà fait chez nous.
It's already done and dusted here in the Grand Orient de France, so we do have women members, and this has been the case for 7 or 8 years now, or 12 years, I'm told. Therefore, it is official, it is officially in place in France. We had the first woman who was part of a national instance, Cécile, and she was followed by Audrey de Planck, who is the Councillor of the Order, and this under the auspice of the Grand Master. We have a second woman who is also part of the Supreme Order, and in the United States we have 2 chapters of French Rite, one of them being the Grand Orient de France and another in Canada. Therefore, maybe come here, send your women over to us.
See why he's Supreme Commander. I have to have an opinion. I thought the Grand Orient did a great thing to have the variety of expressions available to everyone. So as I understand it, one can be a member of a male lodge, a mixed lodge, or a women's lodge. I hope I got that right. And I feel that we should give people that choice. And that we can exist in a grand jurisdiction with the choices that are available. When I was a student at Harvard, if they found a woman in your room, they threw you out of the university. Today, the women and men at Harvard have the same bedrooms. They have the same dorm rooms. In fact, when I was a student at Harvard, they would throw you out if they found a beer in your room. So things change. And one of the refreshing things about the Grand Orient is that they actually accept the fact that this is the year 2022, not 1822 or 1922. And I have been an advocate of our opening our doors to people because we teach a philosophy of life, and how strange it is then to, if I may say so, my friends, to say people cannot partake of this because of their race or their sex. It's totally unacceptable, unacceptable. And as for regularity, I think that is ridiculous historically, and I am going to certainly see at the next Congress that we have several papers about regularity. And I want to say in anticipation, regularity was partly provoked by racial discrimination. No question in my mind, seeing some of the things that are being worked on now. It is unacceptable. And I think if anybody's going to be irregular, it's some of the regular lodges. They're irregular. Well, don't get me started on it. At any rate, I hope the catering is here. The catering will escalate like the stock market as we get towards lunch, I hope. And then it will run all day. And then tonight we'll send you on your merry way from the museum, great treasure, with more books and things and some few surprises for you. Again, thank you for all of your participation. These are the kind of people. We are now in adjournment for a short break.